March 17, 1952, 11:47 in the morning, Manhattan Criminal Courthouse, Room 4B. The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of the stenographer's pen and the slow, deliberate footsteps of Judge Harold Whitmore as he climbed to his elevated bench. Bumpy Johnson stood at the defendant's table, his hands clasped in front of him, his gray suit pressed and immaculate despite 3 weeks in a holding cell. His attorney, a young black lawyer named Theodore Williams, stood beside him, papers trembling slightly in his hands. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with Harlem residents who had taken the day off work, who had ridden the subway downtown, who had stood in line for 2 hours just to witness this moment. Because this was not just a trial. This was a statement. The federal government had spent 4 years building this case. Conspiracy charges, racketeering, tax evasion. They had flipped witnesses, seized documents, tapped phones. They had thrown everything they had at Ellsworth. Bumpy Johnson, the man they called the Godfather of Harlem, and now Judge Harold Whitmore was about to deliver the sentence. Whitmore was 63 years old, silver-haired, descended from old New York money. His grandfather had been a state senator. His father had been a federal prosecutor. Harold Whitmore had spent 31 years on the bench, and in all that time, he had never hidden his contempt for the people who stood before him. Especially people who looked like Bumpy Johnson. The judge settled into his chair, adjusted his glasses, and looked down at the man standing before him. There was something in his eyes that day. Something beyond judicial authority. Something personal. Ellsworth Johnson, Judge Whitmore began, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. You have been found guilty of conspiracy to violate federal gambling statutes, of tax evasion in the amount of $47,000, and of corrupting public officials. The charges against you represent a pattern of criminal behavior spanning 2 decades. Bumpy did not move, did not blink. His face was stone, but inside, something was calculating. Always calculating. Whitmore continued. The prosecution has recommended a sentence of 5 to 7 years. However, the court has discretion in these matters. The judge paused, and that is when he smiled. Not a judicial smile, not the neutral expression of a man administering justice. This was something else entirely. This was pleasure. Looking at you, Whitmore said, leaning forward slightly, I see everything that is wrong with your kind. You come to this city, you corrupt our institutions, you prey upon your own people, and you have the audacity to stand there in your fancy suit as if you were somehow respectable. The courtroom stirred. Theodore Williams started to object, but Bumpy put a hand on his arm. Let him talk. Whitmore noticed the gesture and his smile widened. The defendant does not even have the decency to show remorse. Very well. He picked up his gavel. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, I hereby sentence you to 10 years in federal prison, to be served at the Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, someone in the back started crying. 10 years. The prosecution had asked for 5 to 7. Whitmore had doubled it, but the judge was not finished. He stood up from his bench, something judges almost never did during sentencing, and he looked directly at Bumpy Johnson. And he laughed. Not a chuckle, not a suppressed smile, a full, open laugh that rang through that courtroom like a bell. You thought you were untouchable, Whitmore said through his laughter. You thought you were some kind of king. Well, look at you now. You are nothing. You are going to die in Alcatraz, and when you do, nobody will remember your name. Bumpy Johnson stood perfectly still. His attorney was frozen in shock. The bailiffs were already moving forward to take Bumpy into custody. But in that moment, before the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Bumpy spoke. Just loud enough for everyone to hear. 6 months. 2 words. Whitmore stopped laughing. What did you say? 6 months. Bumpy repeated, his voice calm, his eyes locked on the judge. In 6 months, you will understand something, Your Honor. You will understand that respect is not given by a robe. It is earned, and it can be taken away. The bailiffs grabbed Bumpy's arms. They pulled him toward the side door that led to the holding cells. As he walked, Bumpy did not look back at the judge. Did not struggle against the bailiffs. He walked with his head high, like a man who knew something that everyone else in that room did not. Because he did. Bumpy Johnson had been playing chess since he was 12 years old. He had learned the game in the alleys of Charleston, South Carolina, before his family moved north. He had perfected it in prison, during his first stint in Sing Sing in 1932. And he had applied its principles to everything he did. In chess, you do not react to your opponent's moves. You anticipate them. You set traps that do not spring for 10, 15, 20 moves. You sacrifice pieces to gain position. And sometimes, you let your opponent think they have won just so you can watch their face when they realize they have lost everything. Judge Harold Whitmore thought he had won. He had sentenced Bumpy Johnson to 10 years. He had laughed in his face. He had humiliated him in front of 300 witnesses. What Whitmore did not know, what he could not possibly have known, was that Bumpy Johnson had been preparing for this moment for 6 months before the trial even started. To understand what happened next, you have to understand who Harold Whitmore really was. On the surface, he was a respected federal judge. 31 years on the bench. Hundreds of cases. A reputation for being tough on crime, especially organized crime. The newspapers called him the Hammer because of his harsh sentences. Politicians praised him. Law enforcement loved him. But underneath that surface, Harold Whitmore was something else entirely. He was corrupt, not in the obvious ways. Whitmore did not take cash bribes in brown paper bags. He was too smart for that. Instead, he had spent 3 decades building a network of favors, investments, and arrangements that made him very wealthy without ever leaving a paper trail. His brother-in-law ran a construction company that miraculously won every city contract that came before Whitmore's courtroom. His wife's family owned real estate in Manhattan that somehow always got favorable zoning decisions. His son worked for a law firm that never lost a case when Whitmore was on the bench. And then there was the other thing. The thing that Whitmore kept hidden from everyone. The thing that would destroy him. Judge Harold Whitmore had a second family. A mistress named Evelyn Carter whom he had been seeing for 18 years. 2 children that he had fathered and supported in secret. An entire life that existed in the shadows while he played the role of respectable husband and pillar of the community. Bumpy Johnson knew all of this. He had known for years. Because Bumpy Johnson did not just run numbers and policy banks. He collected information. Every bartender, doorman, taxi driver, and hotel clerk in Manhattan who owed him a favor was also his eyes and ears. Every politician, businessman, and judge who came to Harlem for entertainment they could not find downtown left behind stories that Bumpy carefully cataloged. Information was currency, and Bumpy Johnson was rich. When the federal investigation began in 1948, Bumpy knew he was going to prison. The government had too much evidence. Too many witnesses. He could fight it, delay it, but he could not stop it. So he did what he always did. He planned ahead. He assigned 3 of his most trusted men to spend 6 months doing nothing but investigating Judge Harold Whitmore. He wanted to know everything. Where Whitmore ate lunch, who he talked to after hours, where he went on weekends. Every secret, every lie, every vulnerability. And they found it all. The construction contracts. The real estate deals, the law firm arrangements, and Evelyn Carter, living quietly in a brownstone in Brooklyn with 2 children who had their father's eyes. Bumpy had this information for 2 years before his trial. He could have used it to get a different judge, could have had Whitmore recuse himself with a single anonymous letter. But he did not. He let Whitmore preside over the trial. Let Whitmore hand down the sentence. Let Whitmore laugh in his face in front of 300 witnesses. Because Bumpy understood something about revenge that most people do not. Revenge is not about causing pain. It is about timing. If Bumpy had exposed Whitmore before the trial, people would have said he was trying to escape justice. They would have focused on Bumpy's crimes, not Whitmore's corruption. But if Whitmore destroyed himself after publicly humiliating Bumpy Johnson, the story would be different. The story would be about a corrupt judge who thought he was above the law. The story would be about karma. The story would be about Bumpy Johnson being right all along. So Bumpy took the 10-year sentence. He let them put him on a train to California. He let them lock him in a cell on Alcatraz, the Rock, the most secure federal prison in America. And he waited. The plan was already in motion. 3 days after Bumpy arrived at Alcatraz, a manila envelope appeared on the desk of Robert Anderson, a reporter for the New York Herald Tribune. The envelope had no return address. Inside was a stack of documents. Bank records showing payments from a construction company to a shell corporation owned by Judge Whitmore's brother-in-law. City contracts that had been awarded without proper bidding. Zoning decisions that had made certain people very rich. And photographs. A man who looked exactly like Judge Harold Whitmore entering a brownstone in Brooklyn. The same man leaving the next morning. The same man pushing a stroller through Prospect Park with a woman who was definitely not his wife. Robert Anderson was a good reporter. He had been covering the courts for 15 years. He knew that if these documents were real, they were the biggest story of his career. But he also knew that going after a federal judge was dangerous. If the story was wrong, Anderson's career would be over. If the story was right, he would make powerful enemies. Anderson spent 2 weeks verifying the documents. He tracked down the shell corporations. He confirmed the city contracts. He staked out the Brooklyn brownstone and watched Judge Harold Whitmore enter at 7 in the evening and leave at 6 in the morning. He talked to neighbors who had seen Whitmore for years and assumed he was the woman's husband. The story was true, all of it, but Anderson hesitated. He had a family, a mortgage, a career he had built over 2 decades. Exposing a federal judge could make him famous, but it could also destroy him. That is when the second envelope arrived. This one contained more documents. Records of cases where Whitmore's son's law firm had appeared before Whitmore's court. Win rates that were statistically impossible. Exposed communication between Whitmore and the firms. Senior partners that showed clear collusion. And a note, typed on plain white paper. The truth does not care about your comfort. Publish or someone else will. Robert Anderson published. The first story appeared in the New York Herald Tribune on September 19, 1952. Exactly 6 months and 2 days after Bumpy Johnson's sentencing. The headline read Federal Judge Linked to Corruption, Secret Family. The story was devastating. It detailed the construction contracts, the zoning deals, the law firm arrangements. It included the photographs of Whitmore entering the Brooklyn brownstone. It quoted neighbors who confirmed he had been visiting for nearly 2 decades. It named Evelyn Carter and the 2 children Whitmore had fathered. And it quoted Whitmore's wife, Margaret, who had been shown the photographs by a reporter and had collapsed in shock, saying she had no idea her husband had been living a double life for 18 years. The story exploded. Every newspaper in New York picked it up. Radio stations interrupted programming to announce the scandal. Politicians who had praised Whitmore for years suddenly could not remember ever meeting him. The Justice Department announced an immediate investigation. The New York Bar Association called an emergency meeting. Within 48 hours, Judge Harold Whitmore was suspended from the bench pending investigation. Within a week, federal prosecutors began building a case for corruption, tax evasion, and obstruction of justice. The same charges Whitmore had used to send Bumpy Johnson to Alcatraz were now being prepared against him. But the legal consequences were almost secondary to what happened to Whitmore's personal life. His wife filed for divorce. His son resigned from the law firm in disgrace. His daughter, who had idolized her father, refused to speak to him. His brother-in-law's construction company was raided by federal agents, and every city contract was canceled. The life Harold Whitmore had spent 6 decades building collapsed in less than a month. And everyone in New York knew that this had happened exactly 6 months after Whitmore had laughed at Bumpy Johnson in that courtroom. The newspapers made the connection. The radio commentators made the connection. The people on the streets of Harlem, who had watched their king get sentenced to 10 years by a laughing judge, made the connection. 6 months, they said to each other. Bumpy said 6 months, and 6 months later, the judge is finished. Nobody could prove that Bumpy was behind the exposure. The documents had been sent anonymously. The reporter refused to reveal his source. There was no evidence connecting anyone in Bumpy's organization to the information that had destroyed Whitmore. But everyone knew. In Harlem, they did not call it revenge. They called it justice. They called it proof that Bumpy Johnson was exactly who he had always claimed to be. A man who protected his people. A man who could not be broken. A man who kept his promises. Bumpy Johnson said 6 months. And in 6 months, the laughing judge was not laughing anymore. But the story does not end there. Because what happened to Harold Whitmore was not just about documents and newspaper stories. It was about something deeper. Something that would haunt Whitmore for the rest of his life. October 15, 1952. Harold Whitmore was sitting in his study, alone. His wife had moved out. His children would not return his calls. His lawyer had told him to expect a 20-year sentence if the corruption charges stuck. And they would stick. Whitmore knew they would stick because the evidence was overwhelming. He had spent 31 years on the bench. He knew when a case was unwinnable. At 10:47 that night, Whitmore's phone rang. He almost did not answer it. Nobody called him anymore except reporters and collection agencies. But something made him pick up the receiver. Hello. Silence on the other end. Just breathing. Who is this? More silence. Then a voice. Calm. Measured. Familiar. Judge Whitmore. You remember me. Whitmore's blood went cold. He knew that voice. Had heard it in his courtroom 7 months earlier. Had heard it say 2 words that he had dismissed as empty bravado. Johnson. Whitmore whispered. How did you get this number? You were in Alcatraz. I have friends everywhere, Your Honor. You should know that by now. What do you want? Whitmore's hand was shaking. The phone receiver felt like it weighed 100 pounds. I want you to understand something, Bumpy said, his voice eerily calm. When you sentenced me, you laughed. You said I was nothing. You said nobody would remember my name. I remember. Whitmore's voice cracked. Then you understand what happened to you, Bumpy continued. You understand that every document, every photograph, every piece of information that destroyed your life came from me. Whitmore was silent. I could have stopped you before the trial, Bumpy said. I could have had you removed, replaced, disgraced before you ever touched my case. But that was not the lesson. What lesson? Bumpy paused. When you sit in judgment of another man, you should make sure your own house is clean first. You laughed at me because you thought your robe made you untouchable. You thought your position protected you. But respect is not given by a title, Judge Whitmore. It is earned, and it can be taken away. Whitmore felt tears streaming down his face. He did not know if they were tears of anger, fear, or something else. What happens now? He asked. Now, Bumpy said, you live with what you have done. You watch your family suffer. You watch your name become a joke. You spend the rest of your life knowing that everything you built was a lie, and that lie was exposed by a man you called nothing. There was a long pause. That is the sentence I give you, Judge Whitmore. Not 10 years in a cell. Something worse. A lifetime of knowing who you really are. The line went dead. Harold Whitmore sat in his study until dawn, staring at the phone, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything except replay that conversation in his mind. 6 months earlier, he had laughed at Bumpy Johnson. Now, he understood. He had never been the one in control. Bumpy had let him sentence him. Let him laugh. Let him feel powerful. And then Bumpy had systematically destroyed everything Whitmore had ever built. All from a cell on Alcatraz. All without lifting a finger himself. All while the whole world watched and understood that Bumpy Johnson was not a man to be dismissed. The trial of Harold Whitmore began on February 3, 1953. It lasted 6 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. The construction contracts, the zoning deals, the law firm arrangements, the tax evasion, the obstruction of justice. One by one, witnesses took the stand and detailed 31 years of corruption. Whitmore's own colleagues testified against him. His brother-in-law, facing his own charges, cut a deal with prosecutors and revealed everything. Even some of the lawyers who had benefited from Whitmore's favoritism came forward, hoping for leniency in exchange for their testimony. Throughout the trial, Whitmore sat at the defendant's table looking like a man who had already died. The arrogance was gone. The silver hair had turned white. He had lost 30 pounds. He did not speak, did not react, did not show any emotion at all. Just sat there, hollowed out, waiting for the end. On March 17, 1953, exactly 1 year after he had sentenced Bumpy Johnson, Judge Harold Whitmore was found guilty on 17 counts of corruption, tax evasion, and obstruction of justice. The irony was not lost on anyone. The sentencing hearing was held on April 2. The courtroom was packed, just like it had been for Bumpy's sentencing. But this time, the crowd was not there to support the defendant. They were there to watch him fall. The presiding judge, a man named Franklin Morris, looked down at Whitmore with none of the contempt Whitmore had shown Bumpy Johnson. Just weariness, sadness. The disappointment of watching a colleague destroy everything the judiciary was supposed to represent. Harold Whitmore, Judge Morris said, "You have been found guilty of crimes that strike at the very heart of our justice system. You used your position to enrich yourself and your family. You perverted the law you were sworn to uphold. And you did so for 3 decades while pretending to be a man of integrity." Morris paused. "I have thought long and hard about the appropriate sentence." Whitmore looked up for the first time. His eyes were empty. "Harold Whitmore, I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison." The gavel came down. Whitmore did not react, did not cry, did not protest. He simply stood when the bailiffs approached and let them lead him away. But as he passed through the courtroom, walking toward the same door Bumpy Johnson had walked through a year earlier, someone in the gallery spoke. Loud enough for everyone to hear. 6 months. Whitmore stopped, turned toward the voice, saw an elderly black woman sitting in the front row. One of the hundreds of Harlem residents who had come to watch justice finally arrive. The woman looked at Whitmore with eyes that held no hatred. Just a quiet, terrible understanding. "He said 6 months, the woman repeated. "And here we are." Whitmore turned away and kept walking. He did not speak another word in public for the rest of his life. Harold Whitmore was sent to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas. He served 11 years of his 15-year sentence before being released in 1964, a broken man with no family, no money, and no reputation. His wife had died while he was in prison. His children had changed their names and moved away. Nobody would hire him. Nobody would speak to him. The judge who had laughed at Bumpy Johnson spent his final years living in a one-room apartment in Newark, New Jersey, surviving on a small pension that he had somehow managed to protect from the federal seizure. He died on November 3, 1971, alone, forgotten, exactly as he had predicted Bumpy Johnson would die. But Bumpy Johnson did not die forgotten. Far from it. While Whitmore was rotting in Leavenworth, Bumpy was serving his own sentence in Alcatraz. But even in that fortress of rock and salt water, Bumpy found ways to maintain his power. He corresponded with his wife, Mame, through carefully coded letters. He built relationships with other inmates, including some of the most powerful organized crime figures in America. He read constantly, expanding his mind, planning for the future. And he kept track of what was happening in New York. Kept track of who was loyal and who had tried to move in on his territory. Kept track of every debt and every favor. Bumpy Johnson was released from Alcatraz in 1963, 11 years after his sentencing. He walked out of that prison at 63 years old, gray in his hair, slower in his step, but with his mind as sharp as ever and his reputation stronger than it had ever been. Because here is the thing about what happened with Judge Whitmore. It did not just humiliate one corrupt judge. It sent a message that echoed through the corridors of power for decades. The message was simple. Bumpy Johnson does not forget. Bumpy Johnson does not forgive. And Bumpy Johnson always, always keeps his promises. When Bumpy returned to Harlem in 1963, the neighborhood welcomed him like a king returning from exile. People lined the streets. Store owners came out to shake his hand. Children who had been born while he was away knew his name, knew his legend, knew the story of the judge who had laughed and then had nothing left to laugh about. Bumpy walked through Harlem that first day back, taking his time, stopping to talk to old friends and new faces alike. And everywhere he went, people whispered the same thing. He said 6 months. He said it right in the courtroom. And 6 months later, the judge was finished. That is power. That is respect. That is Bumpy Johnson. But what most people did not know, what history books do not tell you, is what Bumpy did on his second night back in Harlem. After the celebrations, after the dinners and the handshakes and the tearful reunion with Mame, Bumpy slipped out of his apartment at 2 o'clock in the morning. He walked alone through the quiet streets, past the clubs and the policy banks and the barbershops that had kept his memory alive for 11 years. He walked until he reached a small church on 137th Street. Abyssinian Baptist, where Harlem's faithful had gathered for generations. The church was empty at that hour. But the door was unlocked. It was always unlocked. Bumpy walked inside, sat in a pew near the back, and stayed there until dawn. Nobody knows what he thought about during those hours. Maybe he prayed. Maybe he reflected on the 11 years he had lost. Maybe he thought about Harold Whitmore, About the phone call from Alcatraz, about the look on Whitmore's face as he was led away in chains. Or maybe he thought about something else entirely. The price of power. The cost of the life he had chosen. The weight of being Bumpy Johnson. When morning came, Bumpy stood up, walked out of the church, and went back to work. There was an empire to rebuild. There were debts to collect. There were people who had betrayed him during his absence, people who needed to be reminded that the king was back. But before any of that, Bumpy made one stop. He went to the courthouse where Harold Whitmore had sentenced him 11 years earlier. The building was the same. The stone steps, the massive columns, the words carved above the entrance. Equal justice under law. Bumpy stood at the bottom of those steps for a long time, looking up at that building, at those words. Then he smiled. Not a triumphant smile, not a cruel smile, just a small, private smile of a man who understood something that most people never learn. Justice is not a guarantee. It is a battle, and sometimes, you have to fight for it yourself. Bumpy turned and walked away. He never looked back. The story of Bumpy Johnson and Judge Harold Whitmore became one of the foundational legends of Harlem. Parents told it to their children. Hustlers told it to each other in late-night poker games. Preachers used it in sermons about the dangers of pride and the inevitability of justice. And everyone remembered those two words. 6 months. Bumpy Johnson said 6 months. And 6 months later, the laughing judge was not laughing anymore. That is the thing about legends. They do not just tell you what happened. They tell you what is possible. They tell you that power is not permanent. That pride comes before destruction. That a man in handcuffs can still destroy a man in a robe if he is smart enough, patient enough, and willing to wait for the right moment. Bumpy Johnson understood this better than anyone. He did not seek revenge for revenge's sake. He did not act out of anger or wounded pride. He acted out of something deeper. A belief that respect must be earned. That justice must be served. And that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the consequences of their actions. When Harold Whitmore laughed at Bumpy Johnson in that courtroom, he thought he was looking down at a defeated man. He thought the robe, the gavel, the power of the federal government made him invincible. But he was wrong. He was looking at a man who had already won. A man who had spent years preparing for this moment. A man who understood that the real victory was not in avoiding the sentence, but in showing the world who Harold Whitmore really was. 6 months. That is all it took. 6 months to destroy 31 years of carefully constructed lies. 6 months to expose every secret, every corruption, every hypocrisy that Whitmore had hidden behind his judicial robe. 6 months to teach Whitmore, and everyone watching, that Bumpy Johnson's word was bond. Bumpy Johnson lived another 5 years after his return to Harlem. He died on July 7, 1968, of a heart attack while eating at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue. He was 62 years old. At his funeral, over 2,000 people came to pay their respects. Politicians, entertainers, community leaders, ordinary Harlem residents who remembered what he had done for them. They lined the streets for blocks, watching the procession, remembering the man who had protected their neighborhood for 40 years. And among all the stories they told that day, all the legends they recounted, one kept coming up again and again. The story of the judge who laughed. The story of 6 months. The story of how Bumpy Johnson, even while locked in a cell on Alcatraz, had reached across 3,000 miles and destroyed a man who thought he was untouchable. That is the thing about Bumpy Johnson. He did not just run Harlem. He represented something, an idea, a promise. The promise that no matter how powerful your enemies were, no matter how stacked the odds seemed, there was always a way to win if you were smart enough, patient enough, and willing to play the long game. Judge Harold Whitmore thought his robe made him a king. But robes can be taken off. Titles can be stripped away. Power can evaporate like morning fog when the sun comes up. What cannot be taken away is respect. Real respect. The kind that is earned through decades of keeping your word, protecting your community, and standing tall even when the whole world is trying to push you down. Bumpy Johnson earned that respect. And he kept it until the day he died. Harold Whitmore never had it. Not really. He had fear. He had authority. He had the power to send men to prison and ruin their lives. But he never had respect. And when the truth came out, When the documents were published and the photographs were seen and the secret family was exposed, everyone realized what Whitmore really was. Not a pillar of justice. Just another liar in a robe. Bumpy Johnson is still remembered in Harlem today. Streets are named after him. Movies have told his story. His legend lives on in the memories of people whose grandparents knew him, worked for him, were protected by him. But if you want to understand who Bumpy Johnson really was, you do not look at the movies or the street signs. You look at that moment in the courtroom. That moment when a judge laughed at him and Bumpy said 2 words. 6 months. That is Bumpy Johnson. That is the Godfather of Harlem. That is the man who understood that the most dangerous weapon in the world is not a gun or a knife or an army. It is patience. It is planning. It is the ability to sit in a cell for 11 years and smile, knowing that somewhere in New York, a man in a robe is about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. 6 months. That is all Bumpy needed. And when those 6 months were up, Harold Whitmore was not laughing anymore. He would never laugh again. That is justice. That is respect. That is Bumpy Johnson. And if this story taught you something about patience, about power, about what it really means to keep your word, then do me one thing. Hit that subscribe button right now. We are telling the stories that history forgot, the legends that made Harlem what it is, the moments that proved that one man with a plan can change everything. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done in Bumpy's position. Would you have waited 6 months? Would you have played it different? And turn on those notifications, because we are just getting started. The next story is even crazier. The next legend is even bigger. And trust me, you do not want to miss it. Remember, in Harlem, respect is not given. It is earned. And Bumpy Johnson earned his every single day of his life. 6 months. That is the legend. That is the truth. That is Bumpy Johnson.